For 99% of human history, there was no such thing as spoiled food. Not because food didn't spoil. It did. It rotted. It molded. It attracted every insect and bacteria on the planet, just like it does now. But somewhere along the way, ancient people figured out how to beat biology itself. No electricity, no compressor, no little light that turns on when you open the door. And yet, some of the food they stored is still technically edible today, thousands of years later. Refrigerators can't say that. So how did people, thousands of years before science even had a word for bacteria, manage to out-engineer spoilage? That's what we're getting into. Here's the thing people get wrong about ancient food storage. They assume it was primitive, a lucky accident. Somebody left cabbage in salty water and it just worked out. It wasn't luck. It was applied science, centuries before anyone called it that. There were at least 5 completely different strategies developed independently on different continents by people who never met each other, who never shared notes, who arrived at the same conclusions anyway. That's not an accident. That's convergent engineering. Different civilizations solving the exact same problem in strikingly similar ways. And one of these methods involves deliberately burying food underground on purpose for years at a time. We'll get there. Let's start with the one that feels the most obvious: cold. If you wanted to keep something fresh, the instinct is simple: make it cold. The problem is, make it cold is exactly what nobody could do, not in the way we think of it now. So instead, they moved cold to the food instead of manufacturing it. In ancient Persia, around 400 BCE, engineers built massive dome-shaped structures called yakshals. Picture a beehive made of clay, sometimes over 60 feet tall, sitting in the middle of a desert. Inside, there's a deep pit. And attached to the structure is something called a badger, a wind catcher, basically a tower designed to funnel air downward. Here's where it gets clever. That funneled air passes over a shallow pool of water inside the base. As the dry desert air moves across the water, it causes evaporation, and evaporation pulls heat out of the surrounding air. That drop in temperature, combined with the insulation of the thick clay walls, was enough to freeze water solid in the middle of a desert with zero mechanical parts. Ice harvested from nearby mountains in the winter would then get packed into these structures and could last through the brutal heat of summer, long enough for people to be eating frozen desserts in 400 BCE. But not every civilization had mountains nearby to harvest ice from, so some cultures skipped ice altogether and used a different resource that was sitting right under their feet: the ground itself. At just a few meters deep, soil barely changes temperature throughout the year. It sits at a steady 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, regardless of what's happening above ground. The Neolithic settlement of Skara Brae in Scotland used exactly this: stone-lined pits dug directly into the earth to store shellfish and bird eggs at a constant, cool temperature, no matter the season. And in parts of Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa, people took this idea and made it portable. It's called a Zeer pot. One clay pot nested inside a larger clay pot with wet sand packed into the gap between them. As the water in the sand evaporates, it pulls heat from the inner pot, keeping whatever's inside noticeably cooler than the outside air. A pot inside a pot, doing the job of a fridge. Cold storage solved a lot of problems, but it had a massive limitation. It only worked where the climate cooperated. So what did people do in places where the ground stayed warm and there was no mountain ice to haul down? They stopped trying to fight nature and started using chemistry instead. This next one is so old, it's baked directly into our language, literally. The word salary comes from the Latin word for salt, because Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in it. That's how valuable this stuff was. Not gold, salt. Here's why it worked. Bacteria need water to survive. It's essential to basically every function in their tiny cellular lives. Salt, when packed directly onto meat or fish, pulls that water out through a process called osmosis. It draws moisture from inside the food cells to the outside, dehydrating both the food and, crucially, any bacteria trying to live on it. No water, no bacteria. No bacteria, no spoilage. The Romans didn't just understand this, they industrialized it. At sites like Belo Claudia in Spain, archaeologists have found massive concrete vats called ceteriae, built specifically for layering fish with dry salt on a huge scale. The result wasn't just preserved fish. It was a byproduct too: garum, a fermented fish sauce that ended up on tables across the entire empire. Think about that for a second. An entire industry, an entire flavor of Roman cuisine, built as a side effect of figuring out how to stop food from rotting. Salt worked, but it came with a trade-off. It changed the taste of everything it touched, sometimes pretty dramatically. So people kept experimenting. And one method didn't just preserve food, it transformed it into something completely different. This is the twist. Instead of stopping microorganisms from touching the food, ancient people learned to pick a side. They deliberately introduced the right bacteria and let them win the fight before anything harmful could show up. Submerge vegetables in a mild salt brine, and you create ideal conditions for something called lactobacillus, a bacteria that converts natural sugars into lactic acid. As the acid builds up, the pH of the food drops, and most of the dangerous stuff, including the bacteria responsible for botulism, simply cannot survive in that acidic an environment. This is sauerkraut. This is kimchi, first appearing in Korea's Three Kingdoms period, stored in large earthenware pots called ongi that were buried directly in the ground to keep the fermentation temperature steady year-round. It's the same underlying idea with alcohol. Around 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia, people stored their grain surplus not as grain, but as beer. Sealed in clay containers with no oxygen getting in, the alcohol content alone was enough to stop spoilage bacteria from taking hold. And here's the part that's almost funny. Sauerkraut, kimchi, wine, beer, cheese. Every one of these started as a desperate solution to a spoilage problem. Now we pay premium prices for them. Somebody in ancient Korea buried cabbage in a pot because they had no other option. And today, that's a specialty item on a restaurant menu. Fermentation didn't just preserve food. Some researchers think it may have shaped entire diets, migration patterns, even trade routes. This one method might be more responsible for human culture than almost any other food technology. But fermentation still needed a bit of moisture to work. Some ancient civilizations went the complete opposite direction and removed water from food almost entirely. If salt pulls water out through osmosis, drying just skips the middleman and removes the water directly. No water means bacteria can't multiply, enzymes can't break the food down, and mold has nothing to grow on. It's one of the oldest, simplest preservation principles there is, and some cultures took it to an extreme level of sophistication. High in the Andes, the Inca developed something called chuño. Potatoes were left outside overnight, exposed to the freezing mountain air until they froze solid. Then they were trampled, physically, to squeeze out the water that the freezing process had already separated from the potato tissue. After a few cycles of freezing and trampling, what was left was sun-dried into a lightweight, incredibly stable food that could last for over a decade in storage. This is functionally freeze-drying, the exact same principle NASA uses for astronaut food, figured out in the Andes centuries before refrigeration existed anywhere on Earth. Half a world away, in China's Turpan Basin, archaeologists uncovered dumplings and noodles that are roughly 2,000 years old, preserved almost entirely because of the region's naturally cold, bone-dry desert air. No technique required beyond picking the right location, and smoking added another layer entirely. Wood smoke contains phenols and other compounds that settle onto the surface of meat or fish and essentially seal it, killing surface microbes and forming a protective barrier. In Scandinavia, this gave us gravlax, which literally translates to buried salmon. Fish would be smoked, then buried in sand just above the high tide line, combining the antimicrobial effect of the smoke with the cool, low-oxygen environment underground. Which brings us right back to something we mentioned earlier and never fully explained: burying food on purpose, sometimes for years. Here's the payoff to that open loop from earlier. Digging underground wasn't just about temperature, although the consistent cool temperature helped enormously. It was also about controlling exposure to oxygen. At Bampo Village in China, dated to around 4,500 BCE, archaeologists found underground pottery jars with sealed lids, used specifically for grain storage. By sealing the container, oxygen inside got used up quickly and wasn't replenished, creating an environment where the insects and molds that need oxygen to survive simply couldn't function. This is also why kimchi got buried in those ongi pots. It wasn't just about keeping cool. Burial slowed the fermentation process down to a controlled crawl, letting the cabbage develop over weeks or months instead of spoiling in days. Root cellars across Europe worked on the same logic. Vegetables kept just below ground level, insulated from temperature swings, protected from light, and shielded from the pests that would otherwise destroy an above-ground store of food. It's worth sitting with this for a second. A hole in the ground, dug with basic tools, was solving three separate problems at once: temperature, oxygen, and pest control, without a single moving part. So here's what's actually remarkable about all of this. None of these civilizations were talking to each other. Persia wasn't exchanging notes with the Inca. Ancient Korea wasn't in contact with Neolithic Scotland. And yet, cold storage, salting, fermentation, drying, and burial all appear again and again, independently invented, on completely different continents. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when survival forces the same problem onto every civilization on Earth. Different climates, different ingredients, different cultures, but the same underlying chemistry and physics discovered again and again through trial, error, and thousands of years of paying close attention. We didn't invent food preservation. We just automated something people had already mastered a very long time ago. So here's my question for you. Out of everything we just covered, which one of these do you think you'd have actually figured out on your own? Cold storage feels obvious. Fermentation does not. Let me know in the comments which method surprised you the most. And if you want to see the ones that didn't work, the ancient preservation methods that failed spectacularly, sometimes fatally, that's coming in a future video. Subscribe so you don't miss it.